They called it a god. We called it a Tuesday. The first time Commander Sarah Vasquez saw the entity, it was standing in the ocean up to its chest, and the ocean was on fire. She was running no sleep and cold coffee when the alert hit her tablet, the feed pulling live from a USEF surveillance satellite that had been repositioned 18 minutes ago over the Kethera Strait. She watched the feed for 4 seconds without blinking. Then she put the coffee down and never picked it up again. "Get me Halverson," she said. "Get me everybody." The entity, the Vorkai as humanity would eventually learn to call it, borrowing the word from the Vorkai themselves, who used it simply to mean the one who remains, had emerged from the deep trench 2 days earlier. The Kethera Strait was a stretch of ocean between the eastern continent and the archipelago chains, and it had been a shipping lane for 600 years. In 48 hours it had become a graveyard, 17 vessels, 11,000 souls. The footage of the last cargo ship going down, filmed by a drone that survived because the entity had not yet noticed drones, played on every screen on the planet on a 6-second loop. The stern rising, the white water, then nothing. The entity was 180 meters tall. It moved on 4 limbs along the ocean floor and 2 more limbs near what passed for its shoulders. Its skin was a pale gray that shifted to deep violet wherever its bioluminescent nodes pulsed, which was always a slow rhythmic light like breathing. It had no visible eyes in the human sense. What it had instead was a series of sensory clusters along its lateral line. They looked, from the drone footage, like gill slits filled with dark amber fluid, and those clusters apparently gave it a 360-degree awareness of its environment that no optical system could match. It had detected the drone at 6 kilometers and destroyed it without appearing to look. It had also, according to the Vorkai diplomatic vessel that had arrived in low orbit 40 hours after the entity surfaced, been alive for approximately 800,000 years. "It is what you would call a god," Ambassador Thessakel had said through the translation matrix. Its 3-jointed fingers folded in the gesture that their xenolinguists had identified as meaning something between apology and inevitability. It does not think of itself as a god. It does not think of itself as anything. It simply is. It has been sleeping in your deep ocean for longer than your civilization has existed. You have disturbed its rest. We are sorry. There is nothing to be done. Vasquez had been in the room for that briefing. She remembered the silence that followed. The Secretary General of the Allied governments, a tall Kenyan woman named Adeze Mwangi, who had survived 2 wars and a pandemic and the political collapse of 3 nations before reaching her office, had looked at the ambassador for a long moment and then said very quietly, "Nothing at all. It will move inland within 72 hours, Thessakel had said. It will consume thermal energy from your infrastructure. It will evolve as it feeds. Each evolution will be faster than the last. When it has processed sufficient energy, it will reproduce, at which point we recommend immediate evacuation of your planet's equatorial zones. We have seen this before, on 12 worlds. In every case, the cycle completed within 8 of your years." Pause, the amber eyes cycling through shades of pale gold. "We offer you our condolences and safe passage for those who wish to leave." 20% of Earth's population had applied for Vorkai transport ships within 6 hours of the announcement going public. Vasquez had not been among them. She was not certain whether that made her brave or stupid. She suspected the answer was neither. What she was tired. Profoundly, architecturally tired, in the way that only comes from days of consecutive catastrophe planning. Her team, 17 people who had been quietly pulled from various corners of Earth's scientific and military infrastructure in the weeks since the entity's emergence, had been living in a converted conference room in the Allied government's Emergency Operations Center, sleeping in shifts on folding cots, eating whatever the night staff brought them. She had learned everyone's sleep schedules, their comfort foods, the specific way each of them held themselves when they were at the edge of despair. She had a folder open on her tablet that she could titled simply Yashiori, a word she'd pulled from a centuries-old Japanese military operation, the name of a river that had once been poisoned to stop an invading force. It seemed appropriate. The folder was mostly empty. It had a lot of question marks. "Tell me about the cooling mechanism again," she said to Dr. Fen Okafor, the biochemist who had become, through sheer accidental expertise, the closest thing they had to an expert on the entity's biology. Fen did not look up from his screen. He had the specific 1,000-yard stare of a man who had been awake for 26 hours and had recently discovered something that horrified him. It can't dump heat fast enough on land, he said. The ocean was functioning as a heat sink. Without it, the nuclear fission process generates more thermal energy than the biology can manage. It has to slow itself down periodically, like a reactor scram. When it does, its movement slows, its energy output drops, its awareness narrows. He finally looked up. That's the window. How long is the window? Based on the thermal imaging data from the last 3 cycles, 11 minutes, maybe 12. Around the table, nobody moved. 11 minutes. Against something 180 meters tall that had been evolving continuously for the last 6 days and had destroyed 2 orbital strike packages and a carrier group with what the surviving pilots described as a single sideways look. "What do we put in the window?" asked Lieutenant Commander Yemi Adeyemi, who was their tactical specialist and who had the habit of asking the question everyone else was afraid to voice. "That," said Vasquez, "is what we're going to figure out." The entity came ashore on the eastern continent 7 hours ahead of schedule. Nobody died in the initial landing, because the evacuation of the coastal zones had been nearly complete, and because the entity moved with the same characteristic slowness that marked its transition between sea and land. The biology struggling, the cooling system working overtime, the bioluminescent nodes flickering in patterns their xenobiologist Priya Suresh had started calling distress signals. It looked, in those first moments of landfall, almost uncertain. The footage that would later become iconic showed it pausing at the shoreline, 3 of its limbs still in the water, 1 raised as if testing the air. The amber fluid in its sensory clusters cycling through colors that none of them had names for yet. Then it took another step, and a coastal city that had been abandoned for 72 hours became a field of broken geometry. Vasquez watched it on the operations center screens, 6 different feeds, and she made herself watch every second. She had done the same thing with the cargo ship. She had made herself watch that too. She did not know exactly why she held to this discipline, except that it felt wrong to look away. Whatever happened, whatever decisions got made in this room, she wanted to be a person who had actually seen it, who carried the weight of what it looked like. She thought of the Secretary General, who she had heard say something once at a briefing that Vasquez had written down in her notes and underlined. "I am not going to sit here and be reasonable about the end of the world." The entity paused in the ruins of the coastal district and for a moment went still. The thermal imaging lit up like a sunrise, the nuclear process overheating, the biology dumping energy in every direction, the readings spiking so high that the automated system started issuing evacuation alerts for areas already emptied. Then the back nodes fired. Nobody had seen the back nodes fire before. The briefings had mentioned the possibility. A theoretical secondary weapon system, described in the Vorkai documents as thermal array discharge. But the theoretical had just become catastrophically real. From dozens of dorsal plates along the entity's spine, purple-white beams stab outward in a spread pattern that took out 3 still-standing structures, 2 highway overpasses, and, this was the hit that hurt, the drone relay station they had positioned to monitor the entity's movements. "We just lost eyes," said Yemi. "We still have satellite," said the comms operator. "Satellite lag is 12 seconds. At its movement speed, I know." Vasquez was already at the secondary terminal. "Reroute the orbital package. Get me continuous feed. And get Fen. I need updated thermal projections in the next 20 minutes." She was moving through the operations center, checking stations, issuing corrections, keeping the rhythm going. This was what she was good at. Not the heroics. She had no illusions about heroics, but the keeping things going. The making sure the next step happened even when the current step was on fire. Her team had started calling it the Vasquez Shuffle in the first week, affectionately when they'd noticed she never stopped moving when things went bad. She thought of it less romantically. She thought of it as, if you stop, you think about the scale of what you're facing, and if you think about the scale, you stop forever. The entity was currently in what she thought of as Phase 4 evolution. The Vorkai documentation, which Thessakel had provided in a format that their translation teams were still working through, described 7 phases. They were on 4. The documentation became increasingly sparse after Phase 5, in a way that their xenolinguist Dr. K. Brennan had described as the Vorkai equivalent of not wanting to talk about it. Phase 5 involved reproduction. They had, at the outside, 72 hours. The plan that Vasquez eventually built around the window was not elegant. She would have the first time to admit it. Fenn called it, an act of collective stubbornness dressed up as a strategy, which she took as a compliment. Yemi, who had a background in demolitions and a healthy disrespect for the idea that problems requiring large explosions were solved by larger explosions, had spent 3 days arguing with her about the core mechanism before finally agreeing, with visible reluctance, that it might actually work. The core problem was delivery. The entity's sensory array gave it awareness out to approximately 8 kilometers. Within that radius, any conventional weapon system would be detected and neutralized before it could reach its target. The Vorkai had pointed this out. Helpfully, Vasquez thought, with an edge to the word that she knew wasn't fair, when she'd asked about directed energy weapons. Kinetic impactors were worse. The entity could detect the trajectory of a missile at 40 kilometers and simply redirect its back array to intercept. What it could not easily intercept, as far as their limited intelligence suggested, was something that moved slowly and at ground level, something that didn't read as a threat. A Trojan horse, Kay had said, late on the second night of planning, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone who hasn't slept and has just said something they're not sure is brilliant or insane. A Trojan horse, Vasquez had agreed. The agent was Fenn's contribution, a synthesis compound derived from what they'd managed to learn about the entity's biology from remote scanning, designed to act on the nuclear fission mechanism the way a control rod acts on a reactor. Not destroy it. Nothing they could manufacture would destroy it, but slow it, cool it, drive the entity into an extended scram state, a forced hibernation if everything worked. If everything worked. The compound had been tested on organic analogs, on simulated tissue, on the best models Fenn's team could build in 4 days in a makeshift lab. It had never been tested on something that had been alive for 800,000 years and was currently evolving at a rate that their best projections could only describe as faster than we can track. "What's our confidence level?" Vasquez had asked. 40%, Fenn had said immediately, which was either admirably honest or deeply alarming, probably both. "That's our baseline," she'd said. "Let's see how high we can get it." They'd gotten it to 53% by the time the operation was scheduled to begin. Vasquez had decided not to tell the deployment teams the exact number. The delivery mechanism was equally inelegant. A fleet of converted municipal vehicles. Concrete pump trucks, originally designed for construction, repurposed because their industrial silhouette read as different from weapon systems, because their delivery tubes could extend 12 meters, because they were low and slow and had the approximate threat profile of furniture. 42 vehicles staged in a 3-kilometer radius, each carrying a portion of the compound. The first wave would draw the entity's fire deliberately, drones and decoys, a sacrifice play, burning down as much of its energy reserves as possible. Then, in the cooling window that followed, the trucks would move in, 22 volunteers to drive the trucks. Vasquez had asked for volunteers and gotten 93, which had made her have to leave the briefing room for a few minutes, ostensibly to review logistics. She stood in the corridor outside and pressed her back against the wall and stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother, which was something she did when things got very bad. Her mother had been a civil engineer, had spent her career building flood barriers and water treatment systems in places that didn't have them, had once told Vasquez, who was maybe 12 at the time, that most of the important work in the world was done by people who showed up quietly and did the next necessary thing without needing it to be glorious. Vasquez had not understood that fully until she was about 30. She thought about it a lot now. She went back in and briefed the 22 selected volunteers and did not allow herself to count the odds. The entity reached the outer edge of the metropolitan zone on a Thursday morning, which seemed inappropriate. Vasquez had always imagined that if something like this happened, it would happen on a significant day. Instead, it happened on an unremarkable Thursday when the sky was overcast and the abandoned streets had a particular quality of stillness that she would remember for the rest of her life. The silence of a city that had been fully and orderly evacuated, which was a different silence than abandonment, more deliberate, heavier. Cups still on tables in the coffee shops they'd passed on the way to the command post. A child's bicycle against a lamppost, neatly locked. The command post was a mobile unit 3 kilometers from the engagement zone, and Vasquez was running it from a converted vehicle that smelled of diesel and old coffee and the specific anxiety of people who had been in close quarters under stress for too long. Her team was here, the 12 of them who remained. Fen, Yemi, Priya, Kai, 8 others. And she knew each of them well enough now to read their bodies without looking directly at them. Fen was still. Yemi was tapping his knee in a pattern that she had learned meant he was working through contingencies. Kay was mouthing something quietly to herself, which she did when she was translating. Not language, this time, but situation, making sense of an impossible thing by putting it into words. Entity thermal signature is at 92% capacity, said the comms operator. Back array discharge 6 minutes ago took out the decoy package. It's moving slower now. How much slower? 17% reduction in movement speed, consistent with pre-scram indicators. Vasquez looked at Fen. Could be the beginning of the window, Fen said carefully. Or it could be adapting. Phase 4 to Phase 5 transition sometimes presents similarly. How do we tell the difference? If the back array fires again in the next 4 minutes, it's adapting. If thermal signature starts dropping, it's heading toward scram. 4 minutes, she looked at Yemi. He was already looking at her. Stage the trucks, she said. The entity crested the ridge above the eastern district at 0614 hours and stood there for almost 3 minutes. And for those 3 minutes, the whole city seemed to hold its breath. Vasquez watched it on the screens, at this scale, at this distance, captured through satellite optics and rendered on a monitor in a vehicle that smelled of diesel. It should have been abstracted. It should have been a data point. Instead, it was exactly what it looked like, a thing that was not supposed to exist, standing in the ruins of an evacuated city in the early morning light, its dorsal nodes pulsing violet and white, its sensory clusters cycling through amber-gold amber in what Priya had started calling a feeding pattern. 800,000 years old, not angry, not cruel, not anything that mapped to human categories of motivation, simply present in the way a glacier was present, in the way a tectonic plate was present. A force operating on a timescale so different from human experience that words like intent and decision didn't quite fit. Then the thermal signature started dropping. Scram initiating, Fen said, his voice very controlled. 76%, dropping. Move the trucks, Vasquez said. She had not planned to say anything else. The speech she'd given the volunteers the night before had been short because she'd meant it to be short. She had thanked them, told them what they knew, and said that what they were doing mattered not in the grand geopolitical sense, but in the specific small sense that it was the next necessary thing, and they were the people here to do it. She thought her mother would have approved of that. She thought the volunteers deserved not to have it dressed up as something more romantic than it was. What happened next happened very fast and very slowly at the same time. The first wave of drones went in screaming, drawing fire, the entity's back array tracking, and burning them down with the automatic efficiency of a system that had been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. 40 drones in 90 seconds. The thermal signature dropped to 61%. The entity's movement slowed further. The biology struggling now, the scram deepening. The entity took 3 steps into the district and then stopped. Its sensory clusters went dark for 2 seconds. Priya made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and then came back at reduced brightness. Amber only, the feeding pattern gone. That's new, Priya said. Is it bad new or good new? Yemi asked. I don't know yet. The trucks were moving. Vasquez had the feeds from the truck cameras up on the secondary screens, and she watched them come in from the north and west and south, low and slow, their industrial silhouettes moving through empty streets, past shuttered storefronts and abandoned vehicles, and the bicycle she'd seen locked to the lamppost. It was still there, she noticed, the small fact of it sticking in her mind with the specific pointless persistence of details that attach themselves to high-stress moments. The entity did not fire. It stood in the ruins with its sensory clusters cycling on low amber, its dorsal nodes dim, its movement stopped. The thermal signature was at 48% and falling. It's not tracking the trucks, Yemi said. Or it's letting them come, Fen said. Vasquez did not say anything. She watched. The lead truck reached the established perimeter, 400 meters from the entity's nearest limb, and stopped. The operator, a former construction engineer named Barris, who had volunteered third and had the specific calm of someone who had made their peace with the situation, deployed the extension arm. It reached out over the rubble field, over the powdered concrete and twisted steel, toward the mass of the entity's lower body. The entity's sensory cluster brightened, amber cycling to gold. It's detecting, Priya said. Hold, Vasquez said into the comms. She was watching the thermal. 41%, 39. The entity moved. Not toward the trucks. Sideways, one step, the movement heavy and slow, and as it moved its dorsal nodes flickered back to life, not at full power, not the back array, but the nodes along its spine brightening from dim violet to something brighter, and the sensory clusters swept the sector in a pattern Priya had never documented before. "It's remembering," Kay said suddenly, from the corner of the vehicle. She was staring at the imagery with an expression Vasquez had learned to recognize as the look she got when the translation was coming through. The Vorkai documentation, section 43, the biological cognition section. The entity doesn't forget threats. Every weapon system we've deployed, it's cataloged. It's not tracking the trucks as threat signature because it hasn't seen trucks before. She stopped. But it's what? It's curious. I think. Kay said the last two words with the careful precision of someone who knows the weight they're attaching to a term. I think it's trying to understand what the trucks are. And while it's doing that, its scram defense systems are. She looked at Fen. Reduced, Fen said immediately. The cognitive activity competes with the defense systems for processing resources. It's like when you're deeply focused on something, you don't hear someone calling your name. He was already at his keyboard. This is our window. This is better than our window. 36%, 33. All trucks, Vasquez said. Move now. What happened in the next 11 minutes would be described, analyzed, and argued over for a generation. The simplest description was this. The trucks moved in, 3 waves, from 3 directions, while the entity stood at 32% thermal capacity and parsed the meaning of something it had never encountered in 800,000 years of existence. Not a weapon. Not a creature, not a natural phenomenon, but a machine operated by beings who had known it was coming and built up things specifically to counter it. The first wave deployed the delivery tubes. The entity's nodes flared. It had finally resolved the threat classification, and it fired twice, taking out 6 vehicles, the purple beam cutting through concrete and steel with the specific terrible efficiency that had destroyed the carrier group and the orbital packages. The volunteers in those 6 trucks had known the odds. They had shown up anyway. The second wave came in from the west while the entity was tracking the first, and got the tubes into range. The compound entered the delivery system. The entity moved, turning, the sensory clusters sweeping, and for a moment, Vasquez thought it was going to fire again, going to take out the second wave and the third, going to adapt its way through the window, and then the thermal signature did something none of their models had predicted. It spiked, not down, up. 40%, 50, 61 in 7 seconds, the numbers climbing in a way that Fen was watching with an expression of pure focused terror, and then he said, "Reactor surge. It's trying to purge the compound. The biology is fighting back. Will it work?" Yemi said, "I don't." The entity roared. It was the first sound it had made in all of this. Not the secondary noises of its movement, not the concussive displacement of air that had shattered windows for kilometers around. A sound coming from it, intentional. It was loud in the way that geological events were loud, resonant at frequencies that Vasquez felt in her chest and teeth, and the fillings from a molar she'd had repaired years ago. It was not pain, exactly, or if it was pain, it was a kind of pain so large and old that the word didn't encompass it. It was, she thought, watching it on the screens, watching the entity rear back from the trucks with its sensory clusters blazing gold-white. It was the sound of something that had never been stopped before encountering. For the first time, the experience of being stopped. The thermal signature peaked at 73% and then fell, faster than any of their models had suggested was possible. 40, 20, 9. That shouldn't. Fen was typing frantically. The compound is working, but not like we predicted. The reaction cascade it's not just slowing the fission, it's creating a feedback loop. Is that good? He stopped. Stared at the numbers. Yes, it's better than good. The entity took one step forward, then stopped. The nodes along its spine went out. The sensory clusters cycled twice through gold amber, and then went still. The massive body swayed, actually swayed, the way a tree sways before it falls, and then, with a slowness that was almost majestic, it sat, not fell. Sat, the way something sits when the decision to remain upright is no longer available to it. The thermal signature read 0. Vasquez stared at the screen. "Fen," she said. "It's in scram," Fen said. His voice had a quality she had never heard from him before, something between disbelief and a kind of quiet awe. "Full scram." The compound, the feedback loop accelerated the cooling cycle by a factor of. He shook his head. It's hibernating. The biology will maintain minimum function, but it's not going to move. Not for. He was running calculations, not for a long time. Define a long time. Years, possibly decades, depending on how the compound metabolizes. I'd need to model it more carefully, but he looked up. Years, Sarah. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Priya said, very carefully, its isotope output is already dropping. If the half-life holds to the decay rate we've been seeing, it's survivable, Kay said, reading the same numbers from a different terminal. The radiation dispersal from here. She was running the model, her fingers quick. It's bad, but it's not unsurvivable. 2 years for the outer zones, 5 for the immediate area, maybe, with remediation. Yemi had both hands flat on the desk in front of him, staring at the screen with the entity sitting in the ruins of the evacuated city, and his expression was a thing Vasquez could not entirely read, but she understood something of it. The strangeness of having prepared for a thing for so long that the preparing had become its own reality, and now the thing had happened differently than expected, and better, and the difference between the world where it worked and the world where it didn't was thin as paper and had just resolved itself on the right side. We need to reach the Vorkai, Vasquez said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. We need to tell them we won't need the evacuation ships. They're going to want to know how, Kay said. Tell them it was obvious, Yemi said, with a deadpan that broke the tension like a window breaking, sudden and clarifying, and people who had been silent for hours made sounds that weren't quite laughter and were better than laughter. Vasquez was already moving, already building the next list, because the creature was down, but there was cleanup and remediation, and the 700 specific logistical problems that came after a victory, and she was constitutionally incapable of stopping moving when there was work to be done. But she paused at the door of the vehicle for just a moment and looked at the screen where the entity sat, massive and still, in the ruined city, its nodes dark, its sensory clusters quiet, 800,000 years old, not dead, sleeping. The disaster, as someone would say later in a briefing she half remembered, was paused, not ended. They would need to plan for when it woke. They would need to be smarter and more prepared and better than they had been today, which was already better than anyone had expected. That was the work. That was always the work. She went out into the gray morning to start on it. The Vorkai ambassador, Thessakel, requested a meeting 72 hours after the entity's hibernation was confirmed. Vasquez attended alone by choice. The ambassador's vessel had settled in a field outside the operations center, and the meeting was held in the same translated conference room where the original briefing had happened, where Mwangi had asked if there was nothing at all to be done. The room felt different now in ways she couldn't entirely articulate. Maybe just that she had slept, briefly, and eaten, also briefly, and the quality of the light through the windows had the ordinary character of a morning after a crisis, which was a different light than the crisis itself. Thessakel's 3-jointed fingers were folded in the gesture of apology and inevitability again. Then they shifted to something else. She had not seen that gesture before. You have done, the ambassador said, through the translation matrix, slowly as if choosing each word with unusual care, something that has not been done. In 12 worlds. In 12 cycles. Vasquez said nothing and waited. We provided you the documentation, the ambassador continued, the documentation that described the entity's biology. We provided it as, your word would be courtesy, a record for those who wish to understand what was happening to them. We did not provide it as, a pause. The amber eyes shifted. We did not expect it to be used. We read carefully, Vasquez said. You read it as a problem to be solved. Yes. Every previous civilization, Thessakel said, read it as a description of a fate. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere, a bird was calling, one of the ordinary birds that had apparently been going about their business throughout the entire crisis, unbothered by entities and radiation half-lives and the particular fragility of intelligent life. Vasquez had noticed a sparrow on the operations center roof that morning. It had been doing sparrow things with an equanimity she had found oddly comforting. The entity will wake, the ambassador said. Eventually, the compound will metabolize. Your scientists estimate years. Our scientist will be working on a more permanent solution, Vasquez said. We have years to work on it, and if you cannot find one, then we'll find something else. She was aware of how that sounded. Not bravado, she meant it as a simple statement of intent. We will find the next necessary thing. We're good at that. Thessakel studied her for a moment with those amber eyes that cycled through shades she was only beginning to learn the meanings of. There are, the ambassador said carefully, other entities in other deep places on your world older than the one you have encountered. Vasquez looked at the ambassador. She thought about the folder on her tablet, the one labeled Yashiori, which was now full. Logistics, compound synthesis notes, tactical frameworks, lessons learned, the beginnings of 17 follow-on plans. She thought about the 93 volunteers who had raised their hands. She thought about the specific sound the entity had made when it encountered, for the first time in 800,000 years, the experience of being stopped. "Tell us everything you know," she said. She pulled out a fresh tablet. She opened a new folder. She got to work. In the ruins of the Eastern District, in the gray morning, in the particular silence of a place that has been through something enormous and is beginning slowly to process the other side of it, the entity sat with its nodes dark and its sensory clusters still. At the end of one of its lower limbs, barely visible in the rubble and the pale morning light, the tissue had begun, very slowly, very quietly, to move. Compound reactions could pause a biology that had been evolving for 800,000 years. They could not stop time. They could not stop the long, patient work of an organism that had survived 12 worlds and the cold, deep dark between them, that had been waiting and adapting and surviving since before the first human hand had ever shaped a tool. It was sleeping, but it was dreaming. And somewhere, deep in the old warm dark of the world, in places the satellites didn't map and the deep ocean survey drones hadn't reached, something stirred in response to the sound its sibling had made. Something tasted the distant chemistry of a world that had, for the first time, pushed back. In the conference room, Vasquez was writing. Outside, the sparrow was still doing sparrow things. The work continued.